Hello, and let's dive into this chapter on the origins and the fighting of the Vietnam War. As always, here is our disclaimer. This is a supplement to class instruction. Some topics and images are removed because YouTube is kind of crazy. This is always an oversimplification. So while I try to give as deep of a summary as I can, there are courses in college that spend an entire semester on just this subject, and we're going to try to get through it in like 45 minutes. So obviously, this is going to be an oversimplification. There's always more that we can do and look at. Okay, so what's an overview of what are we going to learn in this chapter? So we're going to talk about how Vietnam is an example of the containment policy that's been going throughout the entire war. We're going to look at the growth of executive power and what happens when the president is given essentially unlimited authority and how that goes away. There's going to be a cultural chaos going on with the civil rights movement mixing with the anti-war movement among college students, and how all of this political chaos because of this war is going to lead to changes in both the Democratic and the Republican parties, and how 1968 is considered perhaps the worst year in American history. So let's dive in. And there goes my air conditioner. So, extra background noise. We'll also see if my neighbor's dog is going crazy today. So it could be fun. Okay, so what are the origins of this crisis? Now, the good news is we don't have to go into a lot of European history, because actually, ironically, the story of Vietnam is also kind of a story of like European imperialism kind of falling apart. We don't really need to go into all of that detail, but essentially, there's going to be a power vacuum in Asia post World War II. So after World War II is over, we have both the Europeans leaving this region, but also the Japanese leaving this region. And now the question is who's going to be in charge? Basically, due to our containment formula, we know that there's going to be a series of civil wars in multiple regions, and Vietnam is really going to be next. It's very similar to the story in China and Korea. So a civil war breaks out. Now, what ends up happening here is that the French are actually involved in this conflict for a long time, trying to like help in this region, but they basically have to bail. So when the French bail in the 1950s, the question is, what's going to keep happening here? Is the United States going to essentially step in? Um, Now, when this whole thing breaks out, when the Civil War breaks out, as always, there is a communist and non-communist side. And I apologize, I don't speak Vietnamese, so I'm going to pronounce all of these terribly. Just roll with it. The communist is going to be this dude named Ho Chi Minh, and the non-communist is going to be Ngo Dinh Diem. Again, I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong. Please, I'm an Irish white guy. There's only so much I can do. Now, again, civil war breaks out. The question is, what side is the United States going to help? Now, the reason why the United States is going to get involved here, do we have any real deep-seated, long-standing connection to the Vietnamese? No. Do we have a trade network with the Vietnamese? No. Really, the only reason why the United States gets involved here and all is because of this concept known as the domino theory. And the basic concept behind the domino theory is that if one Asian country falls to communism, the rest will follow, like a series of falling dominoes. And, well, we've seen this happen with Korea. We've seen this happen with China. So if this continues in Vietnam, then, well, now there goes Cambodia, there goes Thailand, there goes Indonesia, there goes Myanmar. Like, it's just going to keep happening. So the United States decides that we kind of need to step in some capacity here, mainly because we don't want all of Asia to fall to communism. So the United States decides to get involved in this conflict. The US is originally going to send over just a couple of troops into South Vietnam. By the way, when this war breaks out, conveniently, the northern Vietnamese are communist and the southern Vietnamese are capitalist. That tends to happen a lot in these conflicts. I'm not sure what it means about being like northern of a country and turning to communism. Must be something about it. Good thing we're in Southern California. Anyway, so the United States originally supported the South Vietnamese and sent over about 16,000 troops there in early 1963. The problem here, though, is that the United States is not really going to like want to go into a full-scale war right away. Why? Well, we don't want to get into a conflict that's going to grow with the Chinese or the Russians, right? The weird thing about the Cold War is that there's going to be a series of smaller conflicts inside of it, but both sides are like really desperate to not escalate a war to a huge scale because remember, we have these giant thermonuclear weapons that can wipe out all life on Earth. So the scale of the conflict is going to be kind of slow at first, and then it's going to escalate, which sounds strange, but that's just kind of the way this goes. Now, um, obviously 1963, JFK is going to get assassinated, and now President Johnson's going to take over. Um, the basic thing that's going to happen here is that Johnson's going to be encouraged to escalate U.S. involvement in this war almost immediately. And we don't want to like look weak in front of our allies by losing another conflict like we did in Korea. So there's going to be this constant pressure to continue to escalate the military. There's also this little bit of that military-industrial complex going on here too. So basically every year, we're going to send more and more troops over into this region. But what we're really looking for is a justification for American troops to be there. And luckily, or really unluckily, we find something that could serve as a justification. It's called the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Now, the United States has not officially declared war yet, and we're sending troops into this region, but we're really not supposed to be. So we have to give ourselves essentially a justification for being involved in Vietnam, and this is going to be that justification. Excuse me. Now, I'm going to tell you two versions of this story, the one that I learned in college and then the one that's probably a little bit more accurate. But I like the version I learned in college, even if it's not entirely true. But it's close enough because the idea here is to have like the symbology of this. What's happening here is that the United States has a destroyer, pictured here in the bottom left. We have a destroyer hanging out here in the Gulf of Tonkin. The Gulf of Tonkin is going to be again, it's in North Vietnam, and we're like basically spying on the North Vietnamese, you know, as you do during a war. Now, as we are spying on the North Vietnamese and we have our ship in North Vietnamese waters that's not legally supposed to be there, here's a story that's not 1,000% true. Essentially a North Vietnamese like fishing boat. Imagine a wooden fishing boat with like 3 dudes sitting on it fishing. Decides to take a couple of pot shots at the at the U.S. ship, and the United States responds by saying, "We've been attacked by the North Vietnamese." Now, in reality, it's not a fishing boat, and it's not like it's a bunch of farmers that fire on an American ship. Like, there is a little bit more firepower here, but again, it's very disproportionate. This is not two equal sides of the same coin here. The United States has significantly more military power in this regard. And in response to this, there's going to be Johnson issues something called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution to Congress. And essentially what this says is that he's going to ask Congress for the authority to essentially like respond to this incident and make the American troops safe. Remember, we weren't supposed to be there in the first place, and there's a completely disproportionate level. Imagine someone like, I don't know, throwing a couple of rocks against the portables, and then us responding by, I don't know, imagine it's some kid at Royan throwing a couple of rocks against the portables, and then the response is to have the football team go and beat them up, right? Like, this might not necessarily be a proportional response on the Americans. Now, the United States never actually declares war on Vietnam, but Congress is essentially going to give President Johnson and possibly future presidents essentially unlimited power to use the military in Vietnam, essentially without even consulting Congress with what the president's going to do. Within a year, we're going to escalate. So by June of 1965, we're going to have over 50,000 troops sent into Vietnam. And the United States is going to begin a heavy bombing campaign in Vietnam. In fact, the United States drops 3 times more bombs in Vietnam than they did in all of World War II. By 1967, over 500,000 troops are in Vietnam with no end in sight. Now, the fighting in Vietnam kind of, well, for lack of a better phrase, stinks. And again, this is where it's really interesting and often tragic to read narratives of Vietnam soldiers. When I was in college, we interviewed a lot of Vietnam vets, and one of the things our professor, who was a Vietnam vet, told us is that we have to be careful with what we talk about and what we ask, because a lot of people that were involved in the Vietnam War have some difficulties with what kind of fighting happened there. The thing is, the Vietnamese are, or sorry, the fighting in Vietnam is going to be very different than any kind of fighting we've done before. There is no front in Vietnam. Like when we talked about the Civil War or even World War II, it's basically one side of troops is on one side, the other side is on the other, and they kind of just walk towards each other and fire. That's how war has kind of gone. That's essentially how the Civil War went. That's how World War I went. To a lesser extent, that's how World War II went. But in Vietnam, it's not like that. The thing is, there is no necessarily largely organized North Vietnamese army. By the way, the North Vietnamese army, the Communist army, are called the Viet Cong. Now, it's not like the Viet Cong are going to be wearing uniforms per se, and it's not like they're going to be in a big giant line. Instead, what would happen essentially is that the American army would kind of wander into a clearing of a jungle. So they're wandering through a jungle, which you can imagine how hard it would be to fight a war when you can't see anything because you're like, on a hike through a jungle. Then there'd be a random clearing. And in this random clearing, there'd be like a little village. Now, the Americans would wander into this village, and again, you don't see any soldiers, and they're just like, farming villagers, right? How would you know that the people that are in this village, if they are on your side or on the other side? And I don't mean this in some sort of, Americans can't tell Asian people apart type of thing. But again, you're fighting a country's civil war. How do you know when you're walking into a village if it's a North Vietnamese, Viet Cong communist village or a South Vietnamese capitalist village, right? They're just farmers in a little village in a clearing. How do you know? The thing is, you don't. And what would happen a lot is going to be a series of guerrilla tactics where the American army would come into a clearing and see like a bunch of women and children, because the men would go run and hide. They'd see a bunch of women and children, and obviously you don't want to fire on them, right? So they'd go into the clearing and they would talk to the women and children, and then all of a sudden some Viet Cong soldier would come out of the jungle and start shooting at them from behind. So I guess you could say that the Vietnam War is not necessarily a fair fight either. If you look at the disparity between the military capabilities of the Viet Cong versus the U.S. Army, the U.S. Army wins this war 100 times out of 100, right? If it's a fair fight, but it's not a fair fight. So if you wander into a village, you have no idea if anyone there is on your side or not, and obviously you don't want to shoot the women and children. How do you know who to fire at? On top of that, when you do guerrilla warfare, the Viet Cong were really good at hiding in the jungle. They would build these networks of underground tunnels that are actually still there. If you go to Vietnam, you can go and tour them. And they would hide, and it's pretty difficult to fight back against. Believe it or not, when George Lucas made the 1983 film Return of the Jedi, he basically showed the Ewoks as kind of being like the North Viet Cong army, and the Empire is the United States. So watch the Battle for Endor and see how the Ewoks use guerrilla tactics against the Imperials, and that's essentially how the Vietnam War looks. I'm not saying the Viet Cong are Ewoks, but George Lucas did. Okay, so what do we do in this case? Well, if the opponent is going to hide in the jungle, the only way to actually stop it is to set the jungle on fire. We would use this thing called napalm. Napalm is essentially frozen gasoline, and what you do with napalm is you launch it usually from an airplane, and it sticks, because it's frozen, it sticks to the jungle, because again, this is a rainforest. And then You light the fumes on fire, and it makes a huge giant fireball, and that's essentially how a lot of the jungle is going to be burned down in Vietnam. So to help fight the Vietnam War, the United States basically sets a rainforest on fire, which, shouldn't be possible, but that's kind of what we do. Now, because of this type of fighting, the morale of the Vietnam War is very low. The average soldier kind of hates to fight in the Vietnam War. And in fact, a lot of the people that fight are not proud of it. Because again, this is not necessarily a glorious war. And on top of that, excuse me, a lot of the soldiers that end up fighting in this war are going to be drafted. Remember, we talked about the selective service system before, this idea that males, once they turn 18, have to register for a draft. Well, a draft is going to be called during the Vietnam War. As we escalate and bring in more and more troops, a draft is going to be called. And because of this, a lot of the people that end up fighting this war are going to be non-volunteers. They're going to be forced to go and die. And many of them are young. When you watch a Vietnam War movie, most of the actors are in their 30s and 40s, but that's not what war is. Most soldiers that fight in war are under the age of 20. And in fact, if you take a look at the statistic, 61% of war deaths were men under the age of 20. So this kid over here on the right, he looks like the same age as all of you. That is the age of a Vietnam soldier. They're young. On top of that, since these soldiers didn't necessarily like volunteer, um, a lot of these soldiers with the draft are going to be taken from the, let's see, how do I say this appropriately so YouTube doesn't cancel me? From the lower socioeconomic incomes. And what I mean by that is that this war is predominantly fought by lower class and non-white soldiers. Don't get me wrong, there are plenty of white soldiers there too, but essentially the people that are fighting this war don't have the financial resources to get out of it. So again, you're basically taking some of the poorest and least educated and people with the least amount of opportunity in America, you're sending them over to Vietnam to go fight in a bunch of villages where your opponent is not necessarily like, dressed like the opposing military that you would expect. And you're burning down a bunch of villages, you're being sneak attacked, you're setting a bunch of things on fire. Like, this is not a glorious war. World War II is easy. Hitler, bad. So that's an easy one to get people excited to take care of. But like, why are we involved in this war? Because a bunch of possibly poor farmers in Vietnam might want to have a different economic system and they don't trade with us anyway. Like, that's really kind of a hard thing to get the American public to really get excited behind. Again, really easy to get excited to kill Hitler. It's a lot harder to get excited to set a rainforest on fire because of reasons. And that's kind of why morale is going to be bad in this war. By the way, here's an interesting stat about this. The Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, had a controversial idea to draft 100,000 of the lowest IQ people in America to be soldiers in Vietnam. By the end of the war, over 300,000 people were drafted from among this group. They're going to die in disproportionate numbers. Afterwards, a law is passed saying you can't recruit the lowest 12% on the IQ range to join the military. So we literally are going to send the people that have the least understanding of what's going on in this war to go fight and die. It's kind of crazy that that was officially government policy, but it was. Now, what starts to happen here, and again, you'll notice that there's a bunch of pictures that are not here, and that's just because YouTube flagged this video. I'm actually remaking it. YouTube flagged this video because it had like guns on it and stuff, so I had to, whatever. And now they might flag it because I said that word, darn it. How do you talk about a war and not mention like munitions? Anyway, this war is going to be different from any other war. During the World War II, the US government actually limited the ability of the media to report on the war. But that's not going to happen in the Vietnam War. In the Vietnam War, we're going to have like news reporters embedded with the troops, and they're going to be essentially live streaming the war. So what happens here is that we have like the official line from the US government saying this war is going great and blah 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 and we need more troops and blah 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 and we're winning. But then the American public can essentially watch this war on TV at dinner every night. Uh, in case you guys don't know, television is essentially a big phone, and there'd only be one in a household, and everybody would sit around that and watch TV together. Because again, just like you, they still don't want to talk to each other while having meals, but they only have access to one sort of form of entertainment. I know, can you imagine? What a horrible time. Regardless of the war, it was horrible because people had to actually communicate. So, this is what we call the living room war. And the idea behind the living room war is that the American public essentially is watching this war happen in real time. This had never happened before. And what starts to happen is there's going to be something that we call a credibility gap, where the government is telling us one thing about this conflict, but then we're seeing another. And as we see what this conflict really is, there becomes this understanding of, maybe, just maybe, the government might not be telling us the truth. Now, you guys live in the modern era, and you're pretty used to us not being able to trust pretty much any elected official at any level. That there's like this healthy lack of trust that we have with leadership in America. But the thing is, it didn't used to be that way. People used to essentially trust any elected official. But the credibility gap is where this starts to change. Really, it's in the start of the Vietnam War in the 60s and 70s that there becomes this inherent distrust of government officials. It's just very different from the way it used to be because, again, maybe they might have a vested interest to not tell us the truth. And where we really start to see this happening is that there's going to be a fracturing in the Democratic Party. Remember, this war is essentially started by JFK and Lyndon Baines Johnson. Those are both Democrats. And what starts to happen is as this war becomes unpopular, the Democratic Party starts to fracture, especially among the youth. The Democratic Party is going to start to splinter, especially these like the youth, because they have to might go and fight this war. What starts to happen here is that we're going to see this final, I don't want to say the final coalition of the political parties, but this is going to be where they really start to shift. The Democratic Party, especially the youth, is going to push more liberal and be anti-war. And the Republican Party is going to push to be more conservative. And we're going to see this kind of play out throughout the rest of this chapter. But again, essentially, this war is fracturing the Democratic Party. And there's no better way to explain how the Democratic Party is fracturing than something like Woodstock. We call this the counterculture. And essentially what's happening here is that the younger generation who doesn't want to get involved in this war is going to essentially start doing a series of protests against the war effort. We're going to watch a video in class, actually several short videos in class that will explain this better. So hopefully you've seen those. But essentially, what happens at Woodstock is that it's going to be a giant concert held in like this random farm in New York, by the way. It's going to be a random multi-day concert. And the basic premise of this is that the people that are at this concert should make love and not war. And they do. But again, I'm trying not to get this YouTube video taken down, so I just won't talk about that. What starts to happen is that this group of people is going to be known as like hippies. The people that are going to be anti-war, that are going to be against this war effort, and they're going to be protesting through song, through art, through poetry, and through music. We're going to listen to some examples in class, but that's essentially what's happening here. Now, let's fast forward to 1968. I get asked a lot, hey Mullen, what's the worst year in American history? And 1968 is probably one of the top three. By the way, you might be able to hear my dog snoring at this point, so she's not super excited into US history. She's a Maltipoo. She's more concerned about what's happening in Malta, and Malta's not involved in the Vietnam War, so once I talk about Maltese history, she'll wake up, but for now she's asleep. Anyway, 1968 might be the worst year in American history. Why? Okay, well, the Vietnam War is escalating. Remember, it's still not an officially declared war. The Vietnam War is escalating. There are going to be a series of bomb threats and bombings that occur basically every day in the United States. There's going to be a series of domestic terrorist acts in the United States during this time period. Oh, and we already talked about this. Dr. King is going to be assassinated in 1968. So there's going to be this general anger among the American public. We're going to talk about a couple more events, by the way. But there's going to be this general anger among the American public that the government's not listening to them, things are getting worse, their friends are being drafted and dying for no real reason. Um, we're killing a bunch of women and children and soldiers in Vietnam for no real reason. The economy's not doing great. Like, there's going to be a lot of contention that's happening here. Let's go into it. So it starts in January of 1968 with something called the Tet Offensive. I apologize to all of our Vietnamese listeners because Tet is actually not how you pronounce this. I don't speak Vietnamese. There's like an extra syllable. It's like a mixture of like a D and a T to say Tet, and I don't know how to do it. So I apologize. Anyway, so in Vietnam, Tet is essentially like a holiday. It's kind of like New Year's, Christmas, Hanukkah, throw a little Kwanzaa in there. Like it's like all of the holidays kind of put together in one. So usually during war, when there is it's also New Year. Um, Usually during war, when one side or another has a religious observance, the two sides kind of take that day off. It's actually pretty common during a war for soldiers not to fight on Christmas. There's the famous Christmas truce during World War I. During the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, the United States wouldn't do a lot of bombing during Ramadan. So that's just kind of what you do. So basically, we know that Tet is coming up. So the U.S. Army is going to say, okay, well, I guess we're going to take a long weekend. We're going to take the weekend off, and we're going to allow the Vietnamese the North Vietnamese, to do their celebrations, right? You're also supposed to like bury the dead on Tet. So what ends up happening is the United States is essentially taking the day off and, having a beer or three. And then the Viet Cong are going to use this as an opportunity to sneak attack American soldiers all over Vietnam. So, like, over 100 towns are going to be taken over by the Viet Cong army. We thought they were taking a day off. And instead, this is the day that the Viet Cong fight very intensely. Now, if you fast forward 3 or 6 months, the US Army is going to recapture all of the lost territory. And in the grand scheme of things, the United States considers the Tet Offensive actually a victory for the United States. Over 2,000 US soldiers die, but over 50,000 Viet Cong soldiers die. However, this is not the way that the American public thinks about this. Like, we've been involved here for like 5 years. We're supposed to be taking a day off for a religious observance, and instead, the war is still escalating. Like, how long is this going to take? And how is it that we kind of got duped by the Viet Cong? That's essentially going to be the response of the American public. And the American public is just getting like more and more annoyed and disheartened by this war. So now we're still in 1968. There's more to come. President Johnson's got a difficult choice. Like, he really has three options here at this point. It's the middle of 1968. Here's what he can do. He can continue the war like normal, which is not going well. Or option two, he can escalate the war, but the American public is not really all that jazzed about that idea. Or he could pull the troops out of Vietnam. Those are his three options. And like just declare it a loss. He gives a quote that he says, "There is no reason to believe that the communists could be beaten by an additional 200,000 American troops or double or triple that number." Johnson decides that the best option would probably be to pull out of the war, but basically it's already too late to try to do this. And the political party, specifically his political party, the Democrats, are in disarray. In fact, it's so bad that he, in the middle of his presidency, he basically says that he will not seek re-election because 1968 is an election year. And Johnson says he will not seek re-election. So now the Democrats need to get a new presidential candidate. In the midst of all this chaos, now the Democrats don't have a candidate to run in 1968. Normally, you want to stick with the incumbent. So, who's going to run for the Democratic Party? Well, there's this dude that we've talked about before. Remember JFK? JFK's brother was Robert Kennedy. Robert Kennedy was actually the one that everyone thought would make a good president. Every good thing that JFK did was actually done by Robert Kennedy in the background of the story. So Robert Kennedy is going to announce his candidacy as a Democrat for president, and a lot of the American public is kind of excited about this because he was seen as the good one. He was seen as the smart one. If there's, like, he's the one that basically handled the Cuban Missile Crisis. So if there's anyone that could handle a crazy diplomatic and war conflict in another country, it would be Robert Kennedy. Robert Kennedy can solve everything. He's going to be essentially the savior of America. And then he's assassinated in a hotel in California, by the way. He's going to be assassinated. Like, the next best hope for America is going to be assassinated. And now the Democrats have to go through this other crazy situation to try to figure out who their candidate's going to be. And there's really going to be a lot of chaos. In fact, there's this, at the Democratic National Convention, which is in Chicago, there's going to be huge protests and riots that break out because essentially the choice for the Democratic Party is going to be announced by the party itself, and the American public doesn't get to pick. And that's going to be super frustrating, especially when you got to remember there's going to be a lot of young people that are going to have to go fight in this war that the Democratic Party started. So there's going to be a lot of anger and hatred. As Johnson leaves the presidency, essentially the Great Society dies with him. And Johnson is a broken man because of this. He's actually going to ironically die the same day that the Vietnam War is officially declared over in 1973. He also dies at the same age as his father, which he was always terrified of having happen. Anyway, now it's time for the election of 1968. So the Democratic Party is fractured, so they're kind of done. And in 1968, this dude comes back for the Republican Party. This dude is named Richard Milhous Nixon. We've talked about Nixon before, right? He ran in 1960. Well, he's going to run for president again. And he makes a couple of simple promises to America if they were to vote for him. He says that he will immediately end the Vietnam War, which is something that a lot of people, especially the youth, are kind of excited about. But he's also going to push the Republican Party to be a little bit more conservative. In fact, he's going to push the Republican Party to try to get votes from white Southerners. Election maps are a little confusing because if you look here at the bottom, you're going to see that there's also this contention that's happening in regards to the civil rights movement. So there's going to be a political party called the American Independent Party that forms in the American South. And this party is a group of Southern conservatives that are opposed to segregation. That are opposed to integration. Way opposite. So they're opposed to integration. It's led by George Wallace, you know, the guy that says segregation now, segregation forever. Yeah, that guy is going to run for president, and he wins a bunch of votes in the American South. So what Nixon's going to do is Nixon's actually going to start trying to push the Republican Party to go gather those votes from the South. The South is typically seen as a conservative stronghold today, but actually for a lot of American history, it was a Democratic stronghold. The big change is going to happen with Richard Nixon going and getting these conservative Southern voters. So he's going to push the Republican Party more conservative to get those voters out of the South, and he's also going to get a lot of the youth vote. You'll notice that Richard Nixon wins California. You wouldn't normally expect that, but remember, he's going to pull us out of the war, and that's what a lot of the youth want. Now, Nixon as president. Nixon's plan to end the war is something known as Vietnamization, which sounds a lot more complicated than it is. It's actually really simple. The plan here is we're going to pull the American troops out of Vietnam slowly, and we're going to train the South Vietnamese to replace us. So, like, we're not going to fight the Civil War in Vietnam anymore, but we're going to try to leave safely by leaving over the course of a couple of months, or really years, which is going to be a problem, but that's We're getting there. Uh, we're going to pull the troops out of Vietnam over the next couple of months, and we're going to train the Vietnamese to replace us. That way they could fight their own civil war. That's Vietnamization. He also issues something called the Nixon Doctrine, which is a slight variation of the Truman Doctrine. If you remember, the Truman Doctrine says that we're going to fight the expansion of communism everywhere. Now, Nixon's going to adjust that. He's going to say, okay, we still don't want communism to spread. However, the United States will no longer send troops to fight in your civil war. So if, I don't know, someplace like, let's pick a country at random, Italy, that place is a third world country. So if Italy decides to have a civil war, we are not going to send troops to fight anymore. We might send money and we might send weapons, but we're not going to send Americans to die in some other country's civil war. Now, Nixon says he's going to end the Vietnam War, but it doesn't really happen all that quickly. Oh, I'm going the wrong direction. Okay, so what's going to happen here? Now, there's going to be two things that happen at once, and again, there's an image or two missing from this slide. Not long after Nixon becomes president, we get word of something called the My Lai massacre. Now, I'm going to try to explain this in not as controversial words as what really happened because I want this video to stay up. But essentially, a group of American soldiers is kind of going to go AWOL, and they're going to do some stuff that was not advised. I'm trying to use the simplest language I can to not get this video taken down. They're essentially going to go against orders, and they're going to massacre this village full of women and children, and use your imaginations as to what other things might have happened to these women and children. This is going to be reported to the American public, and the American public is going to be livid when this reports. Because again, we're supposed to be done. We elected Nixon to end this. Again, the My Lai massacre isn't necessarily Nixon's fault or anything. He wasn't president when it happened. But there's going to be a general anger among the American public that this kind of stuff is happening. We don't want to be there. So why are these massacres happening? And then something else is going to happen that's going to really anger the American public towards Nixon. Now, Nixon is going to make the correct military decision, but it's not the correct, war decision. Here's what I mean by that. Nixon is going to decide to invade Cambodia. What's happening during the war is that the Viet Cong army is slipping over the border into Cambodia. They're recuperating in Cambodia. They're getting resupplied in Cambodia, and then they would come back into Vietnam somewhere else across the border and attack the Americans. Then they'd run back into Cambodia again. So for a purely military decision, bombing Cambodia and invading Cambodia is the right thing to do. However, Nixon promised to end this war. Nixon promised to stop this war. And instead, he's going to escalate this war by bombing somewhere else. The American public is going to get even more upset. And again, you'll notice that there are no pictures on this slide. I apologize. In the midst of all of that chaos, there's going to be a series of war protests that occur, mainly in colleges all across America. Remember, college students are the ones that have a vested interest in this war because they're the ones that might get sent there. So they're going to be where a lot of these protests are happening. Kent State is in Ohio, and a protest is going to escalate among the college students, and the National Guard is called in to protect a government facility that's on the Kent State campus. What ends up happening, though, is that the National Guard is going to open fire on the protesting college students, and 4 of them are going to be killed. 9 of them are going to be wounded, and The worst part about this is that the 4 students that are going to be killed were not even ones that were involved in the protest. They were just walking from class to class. It's seen as a disaster. Again, we're going to watch a video in class that goes into it in more detail. And um, what this is showing is that the anti-war protest is growing and the resentment over this war is continuing. So there you go. Okay, next. The next big thing that happens during this time period is that there's going to be a series of papers that are released called the Pentagon Papers. Now, Nixon is not mentioned in these papers, but what the Pentagon Papers are is they are a series of government documents that basically shows that the US government has no intention of ever ending the Vietnam War. It also implies that like the military is lying to Congress. Like the best way I think about the Pentagon Papers is it essentially proves the idea of the military-industrial complex, that a bunch of businesses are going to encourage America to get involved into a war because they're going to make money off of it. The Pentagon Papers basically proves that that's happening. Now, Nixon is not mentioned in these papers, but when these papers are published, the American public is just getting even more fed up with this whole thing. Like, what are we doing here and why? So the American public's just more upset. Now, finally, on January 27th, 1973, the US and the North Vietnamese declare a ceasefire, which is essentially the end of the Vietnam War. Remember, the war was never actually declared, so it's the end of the conflict. Spoiler alert, about a year and a half later, South Vietnam is going to fall to communism, and now Vietnam is a communist country. So this whole 10-year conflict that really is a 12-year conflict or whatever, and really longer if you include the French, leads to nothing for the United States, nothing whatsoever. We lose again, just like in Korea, we lose again. Now, here's what really matters about this war. The Vietnam War was a social, political, and military disaster. Over 58,000 US soldiers are dead, over 300,000 of them are wounded. Over 4 million Vietnamese soldiers die in this war, both North and South combined. And the war is essentially going to undermine the American public's confidence in our government. So it's also going to kill the Great Society. So this war's got a lot of negative consequences behind it. Now, here's the thing that really matters, though. Here's the thing that makes you an AP student. If you remember, about 20 minutes ago, I talked about this thing called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gives the president power to use the military. Well, one of the consequences of the Vietnam War is something called the War Powers Act. Essentially, Congress is going to take that power away from the president. So now, if the president wants to engage the troops in a military conflict, it has to be approved by Congress. Congress needs to allow the president to use the military. The president cannot use it otherwise. So that's the War Powers Act. It's really going to limit the military authority of the president, which again makes sense because maybe, just maybe, there should be more people involved in the decision to use troops than just one. On top of that, the 26th Amendment is also going to be passed during this time period. The 26th Amendment is the one that is probably the most relevant to you guys because it's the first one you're probably going to use. The 26th Amendment says that 18-year-olds are going to be allowed to vote. The logic being that you really shouldn't be drafted to go fight and die in a war that you don't have a chance to vote on. That's going to be the logic of the 26th Amendment. Now, one of the other sad consequences of the Vietnam War is how the soldiers who fought in it are going to be treated when they come home. A lot of the soldiers in the Vietnam War are going to be blamed for this war. Again, they had nothing to do with it. They were just soldiers. They were just following orders of the US government. But what happens here is that a lot of them are going to be personally blamed for it. Usually, when soldiers come home from war, like, they're wearing their military fatigues, and there's always those videos of like the soldiers coming home and surprising their kids, or more importantly to me, surprising their dog, and everyone cries. That's not how Vietnam goes. In fact, a lot of the times the Vietnam soldiers are going to be flown in late at night. That way the protesters aren't going to be at the airports to like yell at them. Because of this, a lot of people that fight in the Vietnam War are not going to be very proud of their service. I'll tell you some stories in class about this. Perhaps you've already heard them, but that's going to be kind of a reality of how Vietnam veterans are treated. Okay, well, now that we've done all that, let's go back in time. Let's forget the Vietnam War. And instead, let's look at President Nixon in office. Now, Nixon is a conservative. He's a Republican, he's a conservative, and he is going to do things that are both typical and not typical of a conservative Republican. Here's what I mean. One of the first things that Nixon does is he issues something called New Federalism. The idea behind New Federalism is that we're going to, and by we I mean Nixon, is going to get rid of some federal agencies and some federal powers and then give those back to the states. So this goes back to one of the very first things we learned. Conservative mantra is that the federal government doesn't need to do X or Y. The states can handle X or Y better for their state. So for example, we wouldn't need a national government agency to take care of, I don't know, earthquakes. Instead, let California determine what they need for earthquakes because that's where they happen. Like, what does Alabama care about earthquakes? They don't have them. But in California, they're very important. So maybe that should be a state-focused thing as opposed to a national. That's essentially how Nixon's going to run his presidency. He's going to give more authority and power back to states, which is what conservatives believe, and that is what he's going to do. He says, I've often thought this country could run itself domestically without a president. That's actually a pretty good Nixon, by the way. I don't know where that came from, but I got a pretty good Nixon. Now, that's what's kind of expected of a conservative, but then Nixon does several things that might not be seen as that conservative. For example, he's going to expand the Environmental Protection Agency. The EPA, which still exists to this day, he creates it. So that's kind of a big thing that starts to happen. He also is going to pass something called the Endangered Species Act, which basically protects wildlife habitat and species. That way we don't, wipe them out. He's also going to be instrumental in the creation of OSHA. The idea behind OSHA is it's called the Occupational Safety Hazard Administration. The idea being that, you shouldn't die at work and work should be safe. So that's going to be a big policy he comes up with. He's also going to dramatically increase the funding for NASA. During this time period, there's this interesting alignment of the planets that hasn't happened since Thomas Jefferson was president. And NASA goes to Nixon and goes, look, we need more money to send these space probes because we can use the planetary alignment to launch stuff out into space. And Nixon goes, okay. And we launched these things called the Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 spacecraft, which are going to photograph all of the planets, aside from Pluto, which isn't a planet. And by the way, as of when I'm recording this in 2025, both of those spacecraft are still working and transmitting data over 50 years later. It's pretty remarkable. Okay, what else? So Nixon is not so great at domestic policy, but he's actually really good at foreign policy. So Nixon is actually going to do something kind of strange because none of our other presidents have done this in regards to the Cold War. He's actually going to kind of back off on tensions with communist countries. This is what's known as détente, or détente if you're an American. Now, détente is this idea that we should ease tensions with communist countries. Specifically, Nixon is known for easing tensions with China. Nixon has a really interesting idea. There's a lot of people that live in China, so rather than being in conflict with China, maybe we should figure out how to trade with China. And this is actually going to lead to something over the next 20 years where what if we use Chinese workers who make less money to manufacture products as opposed to using expensive American labor? And this idea of everything being made in China, it actually kind of starts with Nixon, and it improves the economies of both the United States and China. Historical side note, the manufacturing in China is going to lead hundreds of millions of people to come out of poverty. Anyway, he's going to improve relations with communist China, and maybe that's better than fighting a war. He's also going to sign something called the SALT I Treaty. SALT stands for Strategic Arms Limitation, and T stands for treaty. Um, there's going to be several of these signed. Essentially, it's an agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union to start getting rid of nuclear weapons. At one point, the United States has like 35,000 nuclear warheads, and the Soviet Union has 41,000. Hey, let's knock that number down a little bit. So maybe we don't need 35,000 of these. Let's get rid of some of them. And really, every president since Nixon has also signed a strategic arms limitation treaty with the Soviet Union, later Russia, to lower the stockpile of these weapons. One, they're really expensive to maintain, but two, they could also wipe out all life on Earth. So maybe we don't need so many of them, and if us and our biggest adversary, the Soviet Union slash Russia, can get rid of them, then we'll all be safer and we'll save money. So that's going to be a way that we ease tensions with the Soviet Union. But if we're going to talk about Nixon, we got to talk about Watergate. Now, again, this is a gross oversimplification. I apologize for how oversimplified this is. There's lots of documentaries, lots of books, and I'm sure you're all super excited to read them. Or you can go talk to your grandparents who lived through this time period, and they'll tell you all about it. Here's the short version. It's 1972, and Nixon needs to run for re-election. But what do we remember about Nixon? He lost the 1960 election by a very small amount of votes. And remember, he lost that election because he was ugly, right? We talked about that. So Nixon's going to be a little cray-cray when it comes to his reelection. So much so that he's going to cheat to guarantee a victory. Here's the sad part about this story. He didn't need to. Nixon was actually a very popular president. He didn't need to cheat. But he's going to cheat anyway because he's so insecure, because he's a big giant uggo, right? It's kind of sad when you think about it that way. He's so insecure about how ugly he is because he lost an election 12 years ago that he's going to cheat when he doesn't need to, and it's going to ruin his diplomatic and presidential legacy. That's what happens to cheaters. So, what happens? Well, Nixon decides that he wants to spy on the Democratic National Committee. Essentially, he wants to spy on the Democratic Party. The Democratic National Committee is actually headquartered in this place called the Watergate Hotel, hence Watergate scandal. The Watergate Hotel is a hotel in Washington, D.C., and what Nixon's going to do is he's going to get a couple of dudes. They're called the Committee to Re-elect the President, otherwise known as CREEP. He's going to get a couple of dudes to install a bunch of recording devices into the offices of the Democratic Party. And he's going to use that as a means of listening to the Democrat strategy so he could figure out how to beat it. Again, gross oversimplification. Now, what ends up happening here is that Nixon does win re-election. And it's only after this re-election happens that a trial takes place. The dudes that break in are going to be caught. Again, I'm super oversimplifying, but we don't really need to know all the particulars. And a trial takes place, and essentially what starts to happen here is there's going to be this question of, okay, well, there was a break-in in the Democratic National Committee. Did the president do it? I believe the famous quote goes, what did the president know and when did the president know it? And as this trial is taking place, essentially no one's really implicating Nixon until almost towards the end of the trial. One of the defendants says, well, Nixon's the one that told us to do it. Nixon's the one that paid for it. And now all this attention goes from these dudes that broke into the hotel straight to Nixon. And Nixon doesn't tell the truth about what's going on. He's not very forthcoming about what's happening here. And in fact, he basically starts lying to Congress. He lies to the American public about what's going on. So he's seen as very distrustworthy, or not trustworthy. Why did I say untrustworthy? Man, English is not my main language, I guess. I'm recording this at like 7 o'clock in the morning over the summer, so I apologize for my brain not working. Anyway, long story short, Nixon is not going to release this evidence and data that he has about what's going on. And eventually, this leads to something called an impeachment. Congress is essentially going to want to investigate the president. Now, a lot of people misunderstand what the word impeachment means. Impeachment doesn't mean removal from office. Impeachment basically means that Congress wants to put the president on trial to determine what did he know, when did he know it, and was he involved. Now, Nixon, rather than face the criminal justice system, rather than go through this process, and one of the many reasons why Nixon's looked upon so unfavorably among the American public is rather than face trial, Nixon decides to resign. He says rather than face trial, he's going to resign as President of the United States. Now, by the way, we weren't even sure this was possible, but he just decided to do it. Um, he resigns and runs away, which means that the American public still to this day never really gets answers about what happened in Watergate. Part of why Watergate is so anger inducing and so controversial among the American public even today is that we still don't really have answers. We still don't really know what went on. And more importantly, Nixon wasn't punished for what he did. It's one thing to lie, but it's something else to not be punished for it. This idea is that the American public basically never gets closure on Nixon. It's part of why, despite the fact if we go back and look at that map, Nixon is insanely popular in 1972 when he wins re-election. It's a slam dunk. It's one of the most one-sided election victories in American history. Yet now, you'd have a hard time finding anyone that would admit they voted for him. Because the American public, both conservatives and liberals, are angry that we don't get closure on this story. On top of the cheating, lying, and everything else, we don't get closure. And that is almost harder to forgive than anything else Nixon did. Interesting when you think about it. Talk to your grandparents about it and see what they think. They might tell you something similar. They might not admit that they voted for him, but my guess is they probably did. Now, one last little hitch in this story. So, one final thing of chaos. So, the current vice president was this dude named Spiro Agnew. Now, before Nixon resigns, Spiro Agnew, who is Nixon's vice president, is going to also resign. He's involved in some tax fraud. So Spiro Agnew is going to resign, which means we don't have a vice president. An obscure rule says that if the vice president dies or resigns, Congress can essentially appoint a vice president to serve out the remainder of the term. So Congress is going to appoint this dude named Gerald Ford to become the vice president. Now, Gerald Ford is not necessarily a bad dude. We'll talk about him later. But the thing is, no one voted for this guy. In fact, he kind of gets the job as being vice president because he's well liked in Congress and not seen as controversial. And he has no aspirations to become president. So he never really wanted to be president. So, okay, we'll make this guy vice president. He'll finish out the term. And then in 1976, we'll have an election and then he'll be gone. No big deal. Well, that all happens in the middle of this Watergate scandal / crisis. And no one knows that Nixon's going to resign. In fact, Nixon keeps it a big secret, even from his own cabinet, that he's going to resign until he actually officially does it. So Nixon resigns the presidency, and now Gerald Ford, this dude that no one voted for, is now the president of the United States. Now, we'll talk about the repercussions of that in the next chapter, but Gerald Ford makes a mistake at the start of his presidency. In fact, it's one of the very first things Gerald Ford does as president, is he decides that he's going to stop the investigation into the Watergate scandal. He decides to pardon Richard Nixon. So Nixon runs away and resigns before he can be put on trial. And then when Nixon, by the way, he flees to California. And then his successor, who nobody voted for, who's also a Republican, who nobody voted for, says, hey, look, there's too much chaos in America right now. There's a lot of anger. We need to kind of keep the country unified. Nixon probably did something wrong, but he's gone now and he's never coming back. Let's just pardon him and move past it. The American public is livid that this is what Gerald Ford does. It starts his presidency on the wrong foot, which is going to be even funnier because the guy falls down all the time. And the American public becomes inherently distrustful of Nixon, Ford, the Republican Party. They're already distrustful of the Democratic Party, and government in general. And that's actually where I'm going to end this story. I hope you guys found this helpful. Good luck studying. See you later.